Well, hi everyone. I thought it was time to do another update on the ongoing saga with the landslide activity in Rancho Palos Verdes, Southern California. I'll start with this news segment.
Landslide emergency in Rancho Palos Verdes is expanding with more land movement detected after our recent rains. The Portuguese Bend landslide is accelerating by an average of 2 inches a week, and that has residents once again worried.
Portion of the Portuguese landslide complex has seen land movement accelerate again thanks to the winter rains.
We had in November, we had in December, as well as January. And so as a result of a significant amount of rain occurring in this area over a short period of time, that rainwater has entered into the ground and resulted in a slight uptick in the rate of movement.
City Manager R. Moranian says they're seeing movement of about 2 inches per week, which is a far cry from the 14 inches per week they were experiencing 2 years ago during a heavy rain season. It left homes, roads, and infrastructure severely damaged. Moranian says the city's dewatering efforts have been working.
We have been working very diligently, spending upwards of $65 million over the last few years of the city's funds to install dewatering wells, to have the winterization efforts to help stabilize this landslide.
He tells us the recent movement is in only one of the 3 neighborhoods that make up the landslide complex.
Where we're seeing the increase in movement is actually in the Portuguese Bend Community Association, not in the Seaview and the Beach Club neighborhood.
Well, I've done several videos about this landslide situation, and many of you in the comments have expressed dismay that tax dollars, city, county, federal tax dollars, are continuing to be spent trying to address a situation that really can't ultimately be addressed in all likelihood. It's the definition, in my view, of unsustainability. To give you a quick recap, this area has had development for several decades, housing development. It's a beautiful area. Contrary to popular beliefs, not everybody that lives in this area are rich, although the property values are quite high. I had experience owning a house in California 30 years ago and got rapid appreciation of that property, but found that I couldn't move to a bigger house because everything else got more expensive. And you have an interesting dynamic as well in California where they've capped the rate of property tax increases. So I think it's quite common for people to more or less be trapped in their property in terms of not being able to move anywhere else from an affordability standpoint, either through price appreciation or simply not being able to afford the higher taxes on a newly purchased property relative to their older property. But be that as it may, I don't quite understand how this situation has gotten to the point that it has relative to insurers and with the government entities continue to spend money here. Again, I'm sympathetic to many of the people that are dealing with this situation who live there. But I mean, I live in the Midwest. I've seen many instances where people were flooded out who lived within the 100-year floodplain. And a lot of people quite perhaps correctly, but rather callously said, well, that's what they get for living in a floodplain. But let's just go through some of the background information. This is a NASA satellite image showing the slide movement back in 2024. So this movement really accelerated in the 2023-2024 rainy season. And most of you know who are familiar with California weather, they don't get heavy snows along the coastal areas like we do in the Midwest, but they get a lot of rainfall. Most of the rainfall in the year comes in the late year, early year months. So that's their winter. And they had a particularly rainy 2023 and 2024 that activated a lower slide area. So these slides are occurring on layers of bentonitic clay. So bentonite, it's a very weak material. And when it becomes saturated, it doesn't take much for landslides like we've seen here over the decades to occur. Previously, there have been decades of known movement in this area, but that movement was primarily from a layer that was about 100 feet below the surface. But these rains back in 2023, 2024 activated a much deeper slide about 300 feet below the ground surface. So that was a new animal. I mean, the people had been previously accustomed to dealing with the movements for that upper slide zone by relocating sewer lines to the ground surface, periodically disconnecting and reconnecting utilities, repaving areas, jacking their houses up and redoing the foundation, that sort of thing. But this 2023, 2024 increase in movement was a complete game changer. But in a normal year, they get about 14 inches of rain. And so far this year, they've gotten around 3.5 inches of rain. And you can see these are the rainfall totals. 2021, 2022 was a below normal precipitation year with just under 6 inches. 2022, 2023 was essentially double at 28 inches of total rainfall. Same with 23, 2024. And then way down again in 2024, 2025. And it's been rather wet again this past fall and early spring. Let's just look through these annual plots. You can see when most of this precipitation occurs throughout the year. But to say that this is a mess has been quite an understatement. This is Palos Verdes Drive south in the Portuguese Bend landslide area of Rancho Palos Verdes. It's closed to motorcycle and bicycle traffic. And they interviewed this KTLA news station, interviewed a local resident. He's also on one of these local slide boards. And he brings up a good point.
My concern is that this is an El Nino year, and so that next year we may have significantly more rain, which means we need to do a lot of preparation activities.
Okay, so what they've been doing with the advent of this increase in rate of movement back in 2023 is they've installed 11 dewatering wells throughout the area. 9 of those are still functioning because over time, with slide movement continuing, those risers for the dewatering wells will shear off. So those dewatering wells can survive maybe a few months or a couple of years, depending on the rate of movement during their lifespan. So it's not a sustainable activity. They're having to run electricity to run these dewatering wells. The water's, I understand, somewhat brackish, so they're discharging it to the ocean. It's not being used for anything. The beach areas are closed to the public, but as a result of this accelerated movement back in 2024, the city, along with the state and the federal government, proposed a program where they would buy out some of the more affected property owners. Many of these properties were red tagged in that they couldn't be occupied because it wasn't safe to continue gas or electrical service because of a fire explosion hazard. And the city received 85 applications total, of which 21 were granted. One of those subsequently withdrew, but they assigned $42 million for this buyout. So roughly $2 million a home. And so there was about 1/4 of the people who wanted to get a buyout are still in the running for a buyout, although I understand there's some delay with the federal funding, which hasn't come through yet. So I understand that these buyouts haven't actually occurred, but they're pending. And then back in September 2025, there was some localized sliding around a 400-foot long zone of some very high end houses about 5-6 miles to the north on Marguerite Drive. And this is something that the property owners are just going to have to deal with themselves in conjunction with their insurers to the extent that applies. Perhaps part of the price of living in such a scenic area. Now, going back to Rancho Palos Verdes, again, just extensive damage throughout the area. This is footage from back in 2024. And you can see all these cracks opening up throughout the hillside area. And in addition to the dewatering wells, city officials have tried to implement measures to seal these cracks to reduce the amount of water infiltration. But as you've noticed, if you watched any of my previous videos, my biggest criticisms of this whole effort is that I've never seen a cost benefit analysis. I mean, you saw from that news segment that the city has spent over $65 million in remediation efforts, sealing up surface cracks, installing and operating these dewatering wells. And I never have seen, again, a cost benefit analysis saying, if we spend this, this is kind of what we expect to get out of it. If you read some of the consultants' reports, they've wanted to have way more instrumentation installed throughout the hillside than they've been able to get budgeted or authorized from a funding standpoint. So I don't want to quite say that they're running blind here, but with the activation of that deeper slide, I don't think the mechanisms are fully understood in terms of what it would take to stabilize the slide, if that's even possible. I have never seen a computation of saying, hey, we need 30 wells, for example, if we're going to stay ahead of the amount of water infiltration and arrest the slide movement. So what you're seeing instead is, I think, could be fairly characterized as hope. And as the old expression goes, hope is not a plan. So I think the days of continue to spend money on these dewatering wells and other methods that are ultimately not successful are coming to an end. And as you heard, this looks to be like an El Nino year. So that translates to uh, heavier than normal precipitation events in Southern California. And you saw from this recent 3+ inches of rain where it suddenly accelerated the movement again to around 2 inches a week. It's just not sustainable, in my opinion, to keep hoping that these dewatering wells are going to lead into any long-term improvement in the situation. And you see this footage, these people living in these heavily damaged homes. I mean, you got to feel for them. It's an elderly person. I don't know what their financial situation is, but either by choice or necessity, have not been able to move or have elected to not move. So California is a very interesting place when it comes to geology and geotechnical engineering. And I'm a geological engineer. I work on design and construction verification for a variety of foundations, primarily deep foundations for bridges. But I also am a registered geologist. So let's just look at a definition here. Geology, the science that deals with the Earth's physical structure and substance, its history, and the processes that act on it. And there are a number of geologists that are involved with assessing the situation with this slide area. And you also have geotechnical engineers who are addressing specific foundation remediation measures for many of these homeowners. But let's look at a definition of geotechnical engineering. A branch of civil engineering that analyzes the behavior of earth materials, soil, rock, and groundwater to ensure the safety and stability of construction projects. So I've come up with my own definition of geotechnical engineering. I think maybe a little more philosophical and perhaps a little more elegant. I'll let you decide that. But I think geotechnical engineering could be summarized as dealing with the effects of the intersection of geologic and human timescales. So if you take a step back and you look at this Rancho Palos Verdes area, this sliding's been going on for millions of years, and it's become more of a problem because people have decided to build houses on top of these slide areas. And you're looking at people living here for perhaps decades, and they're being severely impacted by the situation. But I think ultimately there's just going to be a limitation of how much tax dollars are going to be spent on something like this. If they're spending roughly $2 million per house for a buyout, they could have bought out 30 plus additional homeowners for what they spent on these dewatering and uh, efforts to reduce water infiltration in this slide. And as we can see, it's not wholly effective. Has it had some benefit? Yes, no doubt. But having a benefit versus having an ultimate determining influence on what's going on are two different things. So I'll continue to follow this story. I think it's quite interesting. I'd be interested in your comments, so please leave them down below. With that, I want to thank those of you who've contributed to buy me a coffee. That's one of the better ways to support this channel. I also want to send a shout out to those of you who are channel members who typically preview these videos 1 or more days in advance. And I also want to thank those of you who've contributed to Super Things. So stay tuned for future videos, everyone.